Hi, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today let's talk about the famous writer Thomas Gray. Thomas Gray, 1716-1771. Thomas Gray was born in 1716 in Cornhill, London, England, that is Britain. He was the fifth of 12 children, but the only one to survive infancy, a fact that it deeply shaped his melancholy temperament and a lifelong preoccupation with death and fragility. Thomas Gray's father, Philip Gray, was a money scrivener, that means a type of banker or notary. He was described as violent and selfish, often abusing his wife. His mother, Dorothy Antrobus Gray, ran a small millinery, that is hat shop, to support her son. She was a strong, loving and intelligent. Gray was deeply devoted to her and later buried beside her. The domestic tension between his parents made Thomas Gray sensitive, introspective and reclusive from a young age. Education. Eton College, 1725 to 1734. Thomas Gray was sent to Eton College, where his maternal uncles were assistant masters. There he met Horace Walpole, Richard West, and Thomas Ashton, lifelong friends and correspondents. Thomas Gray excelled in Latin, Greek and classical literature, showing early promise as a scholar and a poet. Eton also fostered in him a love for nature and a solitude, inspired by the Thames Valley surroundings. A sense of melancholy reflection on passing youth, evident in the poems like Ode on a Distant Prosper of Eton College. Cambridge University, 1734-1738. Gray entered Peterhouse, Cambridge, to study law, but he found academic life dull and uninspiring. He immersed himself instead in classical reading, history, and languages. He later associated more with Pembroke College, where he spent most of his adult life and was known as an intellectual recluse. Grand Tour of Europe, 1739-1741. Thomas Gray joined his friend Horace Walpole on a grand tour, a cultural expedition through France, Switzerland, and Italy, designed for young English gentlemen of the time. They visited Paris, Florence, Venice, and Rome, absorbing Renaissance art and classical culture. However, a serious quarrel over differing temperaments, that is, Gray being reserved, Walpole being sociable, led to their parting in Reggio in 1741. Thomas Gray returned home independently. This period profoundly enriched his aesthetic and intellectual sensibilities. Personal life and character. Thomas Gray never married and lived much of his life in solitary scholarly reflection. He was extremely reserved, shy, and fastidious, avoiding public life and literary circles. His letters, however, reveal a brilliant wit and a graceful humor. He corresponded with Walpole, West, and other scholars extensively. Thomas Gray suffered from recurrent ill health, probably gout and a kidney disease, which further isolated him. He had deep emotional attachments to a few male friends, especially Richard West, whose death in 1742 greatly affected him. Thomas Gray was not rich, but he lived modestly on a small family inheritance and a support from friends. His major works. Despite his limited output, Thomas Gray published only 13 poems during his lifetime. Each is considered a masterpiece of refinement and a craftsmanship. Elegy written in a country churchyard, 1751. His most famous and universally admired poem, written after the death of his friend Richard West, reflects on death, obscurity, and the equality of all human beings in mortality. Blends classical restraint with a romantic sensibility, anticipating Wordsworth and later poets. The famous line from this poem is, "The paths of glory lead but to the grave." The next work, that is Ode on the Spring, 1742, a graceful pastoral piece celebrating renewal in nature, shows early signs of the poet's sensitivity to beauty and transience. The next work, Ode on a Distant Prosper of Eton College, 1747, nostalgic reflection on his youth at Eton. Central themes include, "Where ignorance is bliss, it's folly to be wise." The next work, The Progress of Poesy, 1754, a complex Pindaric ode tracing the power of poetry from Greece to England. It emphasizes imagination, emotion, and inspiration as poetic forces. The next work, that is The Bard, 1757, inspired by Welsh legend depicting the last bard cursing Edward I for destroying Welsh culture. Celebrates poetic prophecy and a national identity. Thomas Gray's translation works and fragments. Translated classical works from Greek and Norse. Wrote The Fatal Sisters and The Descent of Odin based on Norse mythology, pioneering an early interest in Northern literature. Style and themes. Thomas Gray's style is known for precision, polish, and emotional restraint. His poetry combines the classical and romantic traditions beautifully. Key themes include mortality and the brevity of life, that is seen in the work Elegy, nature as a source of reflection and a consolation, melancholy and solitude, the dignity of common people, as we can see in the condition of the rural poor in Elegy, the transience of fame and worldly glory, human ignorance and the limits of knowledge, the power and inspiration of poetry itself. His diction is refined, his rhythm musical, and his tone deeply meditative, bridging the Augustan precision of Pope and the emotional sensitivity of Wordsworth. Thomas Gray's political and social engagement. Thomas Gray was not politically active, yet his works display sympathy for the ordinary people. The rude forefathers of the hamlet, as is explained in Elegy, a quiet critic of social inequality and vanity, interest in national identity and a cultural memory, as seen in the poem The Bard. He lived during the Enlightenment, but his temperament leaned toward introspection and personal reflection rather than social reform. Academic and scholarly contributions of Thomas Gray. Thomas Gray was appointed Professor of Modern History at Cambridge in 1768, though he delivered no lectures. He was an expert linguist, studying Celtic, Norse, Welsh, Icelandic, and Greek literature. His studies in Scandinavian mythology made him one of the first Englishmen to introduce Norse themes into poetry, influencing later Romantic and Gothic writers. He compiled extensive notebooks on botany, antiquities, and topography. Honors and awards. He was offered Poet Laureateship in 1757 after the death of Colley Sibba, but declined due to his dislike of public office. Cambridge Professorship 1768. Appointed Professor of Modern History at Cambridge University. Though not showered with awards during his lifetime, his reputation grew rapidly after his death. Thomas Gray's health deteriorated in his later years. He died on July 30, 1771, at the age of 54 in Cambridge after a brief illness, probably from gout and renal complications. He was buried beside his mother in Stockport churchyard, Buckinghamshire, the same churchyard immortalized in his elegy. Thomas Gray's legacy and influence. Thomas Gray's reputation has endured as that of one of the most polished and thoughtful poets in English literature. He paved the way for Romanticism with his emotional depth and a love of nature. Admired by Wordsworth, Coleridge and Tennyson for his meditative tone and imagery. His elegy became one of the most quoted and memorized poems in English history. He influenced the rise of graveyard poetry, inspiring poets like Edward Young and Robert Blair. His emphasis on introspection, death and natural beauty made him a forerunner of Wordsworth's spiritual naturalism and Shelley's idealism. Thomas Gray was a perfectionist. He wrote very slowly and destroyed many drafts. He published reluctantly and anonymously at first. His friend Horace Walpole later built a Strawberry Hill House, the model for Gothic revival architecture. Their friendship bridged art, literature, and aesthetics. Thomas Gray knew Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Welsh, and Icelandic. He is sometimes called the poet of melancholy for his deep, reflective tone. Despite being famous, he often avoided literary fame and declined social invitations. His letters are remarkably witty, full of satire and self-irony, contrasting with his somber poems. He travelled extensively in the Lake District long before Wordsworth, writing vivid landscape letters that prefigure romantic nature writing. After his death, several unfinished odes and fragments were discovered, showing his continuing experimentation with myth and form. Thomas Gray remains central to the story of 18th century poetry, serving as the bridge between New Classicism and Romanticism. His elegy continues to be studied for its philosophical depth, universal humanism, and a linguistic beauty. Modern critics value him as an intellectual poet combining reason with emotion. His reflections on death, equality, and rural simplicity remain timeless in today's world of materialism and fame.